Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you ever so much for joining us again for the Dare Dallas webinar. Thank you ever so much for people joining us last week, where Rachel and I had a quick chat about what we're going to be going through over the next few months, and the Wednesday Club and all of that other jazz that we're kind of being involved in. And thanks ever so much for the response from that. And we're fantastically looking forward to our first Wednesday Club outing next week. For those of you that haven't got involved, please do drop us a line and we'll let you know what's going on with that. So this week, again, as always, very, very pleased to see my good friend, Jonathan Horwich. So good afternoon, Jonathan. How are you?
Hi. It's nice to see you again. Nice to see everybody else as well, at least virtually anyway.
As always. Now, Jonathan, the person we're going to be speaking about this week, interesting fellow, really, to be honest. I mean, I did a little bit of digging. I've known a little bit about him, but Sir Terry Frost. Now, what I didn't realise was he was actually a commando before he even started painting, wasn't he?
He was. I mean, I must admit, I didn't know that about Terry. I mean, when I was asked to write this, I sort of couldn't believe my luck, really. And so far as I speak to you as a man who spent his entire life in the art world, but cannot paint, cannot draw, cannot make art, and whenever I've tried, it's never worked. So I've made it my business to, wherever possible, make friends with artists. And Terry was, okay, maybe not a close friend, but someone I saw regularly, and wonderfully, like many artists, anarchic and funny and inventive, and always on the thinking about the next thing. Such a lovely man.
But not somebody that you would ever consider really to be one of these chaps that was a Royal Marines commando and ended up in a stalag in World War II. It's such an unlikely thing, doesn't it?
It was rather like, I don't know what, like what is it when this is your life, when you go into someone who you thought you knew, and there's an element of Terry. I knew perhaps late Terry, but early Terry is quite a surprise. You see a relatively sort of jocular man who, as it turns out, exactly right, it was a commando. He's a little bit older than my dad, and my father served in the Second World War as a medical officer, and Terry started off as a general soldier, as an infantryman, and then I guess through some skill, which he either had or developed, became a commander, which is brilliant. It turns him even into an actual hero. He's my art hero. And so he gets captured in the early part of the war. I think 1946, he's captured by the German forces, and then spends more or less the rest of the war in captivity. And as luck would have it, he meets in Stalag 636, I think it is Adrian Heath, who's someone that you might have heard of. He's an abstract painter of exactly the same vintage as Terry. Terry, who had drawn as a child and had worked in nearly all his life to that point in manual jobs, didn't think that his artistic skill would take him anywhere until he met Adrian, and who encouraged him and said, you can draw. You have a talent, you must do something about this. And of course, one of the main things you have to hand when you're in Stalag 636 is a lot of time. And so he had all the time in the world to practice drawing and whiling away his time. So when the war was over, he was off like a rocket to, I think, first of all, Birmingham School of Art to study art. And, he probably realized quite soon after that it perhaps wasn't the hippest place to be. But I think the war made the difference. Maybe it's true of a lot of people that the war changed them in some way. So it opened up doors for Terry that I think otherwise would have remained shut.
It strikes me, as looking through his kind of life, that he seems to have had an uncanny knack of making really influential friends. I mean, including obviously Jonathan Horwich, but from Victor Passmore to Barbara Hepworth, he seemed to know everyone that was important around that time, didn't he?
He had that gift of I don't know what it is. You meet people along the way in life, and you warm to them, and you have to be pretty hard-hearted not to warm to Terry. He just had that sort of glow. You see the photograph of him in the article. He's a colourful character in every sense. There's just something really very jolly and engaging about him, and it's not always the case.
Let's just have a
yes, let's have a look at the photograph.
Yeah, obviously him in his later years, but still sporting a rather good World War II moustache, though, which I'm
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
appreciative of.
He's such a jolly soul, and it's his work is colourful, and even his son Anthony Frost, who's still down in St Ives, although he doesn't look exactly like his dad, he is producing beautiful, colourful work just like his dad. So he's continuing in that same tradition.
But his son as well, Stephen Frost, is a well-known comedian as well, isn't he?
Yeah. It doesn't surprise me at all that he's produced talented children. It just is quite a natural progression. But I think he was also, I mean, it's not always the case that artists are popular with other artists. Inevitably, artists' friends, their sort of friendship groups are other artists, but they're often quite competitive. But somehow with Terry, all sorts of artists warm to him. And he's exhibiting in New York. He gets a show in New York alongside all the sort of hit guys of the 60s, and they take him under his wing and get him drunk and lead him astray wonderfully, and he just goes with it.
No, in reading about him in preparation for this, he does strike me as the type of artist that everyone else liked, which is, as you say, incredibly unusual. Now, let's start having a look at some of his work, because you can talk a lot about art, but if you're not looking at it, then it's a little bit redundant, isn't it? So let's start here. And where are we with this one?
Well, this is a back street in St Ives. I don't know. I know St Ives a little, and I've explored, but it's not an area I know. But it's called locally the Digey, Digey, and it's just off Rose Lane in St Ives. And although this looks like a straightforward picture, when you see everything else by Terry after this slide, you'll realise he makes a pretty swift transition from this narrative, in other words, non-abstract image of the back streets of St Ives, to what comes next. But he's not alone, bearing in mind he's following a tradition. This picture is painted 1948, so he's only just 2 years after the war, and really only just graduated from art school. He's studying now in St Ives. So it's really and truly what everyone else was doing, Carol Waite and Ken Howard and others, contemporaries. You sort of can see where they're all coming from. It's immediately post-war British art. And some artists, just like Terry, changed from this to probably what you're going to show us next.
He strikes me as quite, if anyone can be academic in the art world in the way in which they approach things. He obviously went to Birmingham, then he went to Camberwell, then he studies with St Ives, then he went back to Camberwell at some point, didn't he, as well?
Yeah.
And it was always a part of some kind of, he was constantly evolving, because perhaps he was constantly learning from other artists and people and surroundings that he was in.
Yeah, he's probably that bit older than the others. He probably, I think my father told me that the war for him was an opportunity, but also it slightly held him back a bit because he would otherwise be continuing his training. So probably Terry, in the same way, was making up for lost time, ducking and weaving, going to this college, meeting this person, then changing swiftly to another. So I wonder whether he was playing catch up as well.
But obviously, because he hadn't really explored art until he was actually a prisoner of war, had he? So
no.
It was almost like the war for him was just a complete opening of the doors.
Yes, absolutely right. It was nothing short of floodgates for someone who would be after the war thinking, well, I'll be going back to Warwickshire and I'd be working in the factory again. Nothing could be further than the truth when you see what did eventually happen.
Well, I think we'll have a look at another image now, because obviously the first image that we saw is not. I'm not saying it's fairly typical, but it is pretty typical of something that's post-war Britain and something of that colour. But I mean, how long after that painting, Jonathan, did this one come about?
We're just about 8 years later.
So not a huge amount of time comparatively, and his whole style has completely evolved.
It's evolved. It's what I would call a signature picture. You really, even if you're half interested in 20th century British painting, you'd have to have lived your life under a stone to not know that this is sort of British art from the 50s. And if you're a bit better informed, it's by Terry Frost from 1955. And although, and at this time he's somewhere near Leeds, because this is called Leeds. But Leeds doesn't look like this. So he's bringing images from St Ives to wherever he goes. But this is an icon, if you like. It probably is nothing short of a masterwork by Terry, and it's quite on a big scale too. It's 1.2 by very nearly 2 meters, so it's a trophy picture in a trophy size, and one of the rare, pure mid-50s pictures that you're ever likely to see. And it's beautifully colourful. You've red, black, and a bit of orange and white. It really is a very strong image.
I think it's about the most least thing related to Leeds in the mid-1950s that I could possibly imagine, to be perfectly honest. I think it'd be more of a grayscale picture then. Is this on public display? Is it owned privately? It's
owned privately. It came up for auction in 2011 and made just over £300,000. So it's pretty much up there with the top 5 prices. I mean, Terry is quite expensive at the top end. This particular period, the 50s, is what everybody wants. And there's a really sort of enthusiastic band of collectors who really would give anything for something from this period to add to their collection, not just of works by Terry Frost, but to add to a 20th century British art collection. It's sort of become a cornerstone now to own a great Terry Frost from the 50s.
But it is, as you say, this piece is possibly, we're starting with the most iconic of them. So this is a typical piece of what he's fantastic at.
Yeah, and these shapes and lines and colours stay throughout. So even though his style modifies, once you've seen this, everything else sort of fits into place afterwards. So he doesn't, he's changed already from the first slide we saw from a purely narrative artist who could look like even someone like David Hockney paints like that in the early 50s. And so, he is developing his own style. There isn't anybody else who's exactly like him. So he's ploughing his own furrow and creating these very signature shapes. Looks like clothes on a washing line, doesn't it? But there still is images.
Or a banner, or banners hanging down from a line or something like that.
Yeah.
Process. Let's move on to the next image, because again we see the constant evolution of his work, and just it gets a little bit more technical as we go on.
Yeah, and this is roughly the same period, 1955, 56. It's quite a big picture again, nearly a meter by 1.2 meters. But again, just having seen that last one, you don't need any help to see who it's by. And this is more complex in a way. And this one sold in 2007, and everybody, you try and follow the art market, but at various points, 2006-7 was a high point for Terry, and then in the late 90s, early noughties, there was it's almost as if people keep discovering him. Every time someone sees something like this, they realize how brilliant he was, and they want to have it. And there aren't that many of them. These are pretty rare beasts at this scale.
He wasn't particularly prolific, or?
There aren't many on this scale. Okay. But he was making prints at this time and making drawings and sketches. So there's more of those. But finished works like this on this scale, really, you may be lucky to see one every 2 years, I think, coming up for auction, maybe even less. And once people buy them, they love them so much, they won't sell them. So it's not like it's a regular trade.
Was he at this stage in his career actually making a living from it? Because I understand he worked for other people as well, just to kind of keep the money coming in, didn't he?
Yes, he did. He worked in his time in St Ives, he worked for Barbara Hepworth, the sculptor, at her studio overlooking the bay in St Ives, and there's probably him and about 4 or 5 other students who work for Barbara, and I guess there would be other artists. So he was sort of pitching in to help her. Yes,
phenomenal. I mean, again, it's of this period an iconic piece, isn't it? Again, it reminds me of Shattered Windows, and I don't quite know why, but that's what I see. But let's move on. So this is, again, it's a little bit of a change.
Yeah, this is obviously again by Terry, but you're right. This is, I think this is slightly, this is, if you like, the meat in the sandwich. So it fits in between the first image we saw, the back streets of St Ives, and these last two. It's quite hard to date this one, but it probably is about 1951, 52.
Okay.
So you could call it transitional, if you like. You can see that these elements, the round disc elements, pop up continuously in later pictures by Terry, but they disappear sometimes in the 50s. So he uses the circle and the shape probably consistently for about 20 or 30 years. But this is what you're looking at. To us, looks like an abstract shape, but at this point, it is actually something. You're looking as if you were flying a drone and filming down onto St Ives Harbour. So the shapes you see are imagined, abstracted forms that you see. So the black is the quayside, and the white are probably boats, and the red and the yellow buildings or boats near buildings. He sort of abstracted out what he sees.
Like an aerial view of a port.
Yeah, exactly. It's an aerial view of St Ives, recreated by Terry into an abstract sort of top-down view.
Interesting work. Okay,
yeah.
Let's move on to our next one. So if we wanted a burst of colour, Jonathan, then that's it. I'm presuming this is around the same time, given the nature of it, or am I completely wrong?
Well, yes, it's still by Terry, but we've skipped up to the late 80s now.
Wow. So, I mean, I was looking at the last picture thinking, gosh, but you can clearly see the influence from his early 50s right to the late 80s. Is actually, there's still a lot there.
Yeah, there's a running theme, and so the hot sun. I think what's notable about Terry's work is the older he gets, the hotter the colours get. This is a hot picture, isn't it? You've got a hot orange, a hot yellow, but he is using these shapes that we saw in that last one, slightly sort of reformed. What are they, cup shapes or half cup shapes? But the general shape and the design he's brought back, and I think he dips into things and then brings them back again. He's always imaginative and always thinking of new things to do. And he loved his time in St Ives. You mentioned earlier that he worked there, and certainly working for Barbara Hepworth for Terry was a means to an end, but also he had the company of other artists, and they got up to all sorts of tricks and japes and all sorts of things. And Barbara Hepworth, who was at the time vying with Henry Moore, there was a sort of healthy competition between Henry Moore and Dame Barbara Hepworth as to who was perhaps not so much the better sculptor, but the most successful. And I think it's quite, you think, well, back in the day, how many female sculptors were leading the charge? Well, Barbara Hepworth certainly was, and she was really pushing to make her mark. And one of her fears was, because she was so tiny and her sculpture was so huge, people would look at her, then look at the sculpture and say, well, that tiny lady can't possibly have made that, which of course is true. She needed assistants like Terry and other artists to help make her sculptures. But the stone pieces and the wooden carving, she did essentially make herself. And so whenever anybody came to visit the studio, she was pretty paranoid about the visitor, who might indeed turn out to be a buyer or an agent for a buyer. She was pretty freaked out that they may see her assistants. So she'd give them, due warning and say, boys, make yourselves scarce. We've got, Mr. Guggenheim coming at lunchtime. And so they'd all go off, usually to the pub, and come back when the visitor was over. And Terry told me a story about one day when this happened, but somehow or other, the wires got crossed. Either the client was late or they were early coming back. But to cut a long story short, Terry said they'd all been to the pub and had quite a few beers and scuttled up the front, through the gate and up towards the studio where they were meant to be working. And Barbara rushed out to say, they're here. So they had to scatter. and find a suitable hiding place. Everybody found a hiding place, that was all right. And it was okay for about 10 or 15 minutes until Terry began to realize that the beer that he had drunk was beginning to work its way through his system. And there wasn't a great deal he could do about it. So he hung on and hung on. He really needed a pee. And he was hiding behind a bush and thought, well, that's probably going to be all right. So he thought that they were far enough away at least not to hear him. So he did what he had to do, and that was fine. But what he didn't realize was he created his own personal river, which was working its way down the heavy slope. For those of you who've been to St. Ives, you'll know it's quite slopey. And so this river of Terry's pee was making its way down the path towards the visitors and towards Barbara, who saw it. Luckily, the visitors didn't, and the jig was not up. And he told me that she gave him a very hard time afterwards, and he was in trouble for about a week after that.
Gosh, but it sounds like he enjoyed his time there, and obviously took a lot of influence from it.
Yeah, he loved it. I think it was. I mean, what's not to like about St. Ives, really? I mean, it's fed the imagination of centuries of artists in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, and subsequently after the war. The light is great. There's something about it which, once you've been, you never forget the place. And it was an inspiration, even though he had, towards the middle to end part of his life, he was living out in Berkshire. He was nowhere near St. Ives, but you look at his images and you can see that the influence is still there.
I can imagine as well during that period of time that the tourism wasn't kind of at the level it's at now. So probably a lot more appreciation of the space that they were in. Yes,
you're right. I hadn't thought of that. No, you're absolutely right. It was not the sort of, as they call it down there, it wasn't full of grockles. People, yep. Eating ice cream and kicking cans, whatever it is that they do. And they were art shops with probably art in, as opposed to probably pots and pans and so on. So yes, it was probably a very different place, and they could get about their business without necessarily being that bothered by visitors.
Now, Jonathan, I'm going to bring on to the next picture that we've got here. Again, another interesting diversion from where we were with the first one and the second one. So what can you tell us about this? Another use of semicircles and a lot of squares here, but rectangles rather. So what can you tell us about this?
But this, I mean, you can sort of look at this, and in all fairness, this isn't immediately typically Terry, until you look at the red and the black semicircle left and right of the green thing, whatever the green thing is. That's an image that we'll see perhaps in others, or you'll see in other work by Terry. So he's following a theme. This is a picture from, I don't know whether anybody, before I give you the date, you'll want to guess it, but it's sort of typical of its time. It's from 1975. There's quite a sort of 70s vibe about it.
I think the green is quite a 1970s colour.
Yeah. Yes.
That shade.
Yeah, that sort of browny ochre-y splat at the top, which goes right across.
Yeah, of course.
I can remember seeing everybody's, all the kids' high chairs are that colour, and it's a curious colour which loved the 70s, or the 70s loved it.
Sure, I remember a Ford Granada from around that period with that colour. So yes,
it's a throwback. I chose this because it's slightly different, but if you look at it again, you can see there's elements of Terry in it. It's one of his ventures into acrylic paint rather than oil paint. The 50s pictures we saw earlier were all oil paint, as was usual at that time. But this is acrylic, and it's probably I'm not a painter, but knowing acrylic, it's an easier and quicker material to use. And this is an abstracted image again. Very often the titles of these, this is simply called Green and Orange, 1979, I'm sorry, but it's still a 70s one. I thought it's 75, but it's 1979. And so you'll see all of Terry's pictures. Generally, for the sharp-eyed among you, you'll spotted that none of them are signed on the front. They're all signed and dated on the back, on the canvas, usually. I think Terry's view was that signing things on the front just made a mess of them. So it's either signed on the canvas at the back or on the stretcher.
It's what strikes me about this one is the fact that obviously the green part of it is very sharp, and also the black and the red semicircles. But it's almost as if the three splashes of color across the front with that kind of that orangey kind of color, and then the black and then the red are almost a little bit, especially with the black in the middle. There's obviously some smearing around the edges of it, and the red at the top is obviously a little bit more flamboyant than the rest of it. It's almost as if he's putting two different aspects into the painting.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There's two elements there. He's adding something in the circles. Tricky to know exactly what they represent. He's all about color, as you know, using even the color in his title. This is quite a decent sized picture. It's 1.5 by 1.2 meters, so it's quite a statement picture. And I chose this, well, I chose it because I liked it, but also chose it because it sold very recently in April this year, 2021, and it was estimated to make between 50 and 80,000 and sold for 70,000. So, you know, more or less bang in the middle of expectation.
It seems, I mean, I'm not saying that it's cheap, but in terms of affordable art for somebody as iconic as Sir Terry Frost, it seems to be a pretty good kind of price point to be buying.
Yeah, yeah. It's one of the reasons for, I mean, obviously I wanted to do the article because it's about Terry, but equally it was an opportunity to show people who might be thinking, well, they look nice. Well, yes, they are. And just as you say, they are eminently affordable. And, you know, if you haven't got 70,000 quid, but you might have 7,000 quid or even 700 pounds, you'll be able to find something by Terry, either a print or a work on paper. And he is eminently affordable. And, you know, not everybody's heard of him, but, you know, once you get into it, into his art, it lifts your spirits and is, I think, eminently affordable. And there have been various points at which people have thought his work is going to break the £1 million barrier, where it hasn't so far. It hasn't really even got halfway. So, you know, there's still plenty of opportunities there and plenty of work. He was a busy bee.
It's not past its highest point, which is a
no.
which is a good thing to look at. And I think
it sort of goes up and down a bit, not in a bad way. You don't get speculation, but you know, the ones we saw at the beginning, those mid-50s pictures, they're the sort of thing which, you know, they come up for auction with an expectation of about 200,000 or 300,000. They'd end up making 5 because people just love them. They tend not to be overpriced. But no, you're right. I think it's a great opportunity here. Even if you just like colour, they will add to your rooms.
Great statement pieces, as you say. If you like the colour of them and you like his style, especially this kind of stuff, then they are affordable. Now let's move on to the next one of this. And this is actually two very similar images. We'll look at the first one.
Yeah.
And again, it's those trademark semicircles again.
Yeah, yeah, they come back again. This time, unlike the last one we saw, where they're on their side, they're sort of rolling left and right, and they reoccur. Sometimes they take up smaller space on the canvas. Sometimes they're collage, so actually they're cut out of another canvas and stuck onto this one.
Okay.
This is.
I did that. So
yeah. They're not always painted.
Okay.
Sometimes they're cut out. So I think in this case, the likelihood is that they're cut out because they sort of look like they are. I've not seen the picture in the flesh, but it's a picture on canvas, and he certainly does do collage. So I think these are two shapes, if you like, cut out from a sheet of canvas and then put onto this, which is lightly drawn.
I was going to say, is it pencil on top of it as well?
Yeah, there's sort of pencil horizon there, and there's a little bit of pencil in between the two shapes, which are sort of either rocking towards each other or sort of the idea being that they're boats, maybe.
I like the idea of pebbles on a beach, but I see what you mean with boats. Yes, I get that. Yeah,
there could be boats. They could be anything, but there's a sort of maritime feel. And this and the next one we're going to see are both from the 1960s. And this again,
feel. Yeah.
This is a very similar thing. There's just a bit more going on at the top, but they're shapes that he's outlined, you can see there, and they probably are boats. And at the top in the background is probably a quayside or some other landscape image that he's put in. Both of them are about 1 meter by 1 meter, so square and quite interesting forms. And pictures of that size and quality, I think probably the red one is slightly more. The red one, they usually make between 40 and 60,000, but the red one on this particular occasion came up in one of the other spikes of interest in 2006, made 150,000. That's for the red and black one.
That's a reasonable amount for it then.
Yeah, it's good money. And this one, which I came up a bit later, I think. No, but both came out together. Sorry, that's completely wrong. This one made 42. So
it's quite a contrast, isn't it?
People like red, don't they? I think these more somber colours, and like black is perhaps never an easy colour. But I just thought it was amusing to see two pictures which are more or less identical in size and date, and by the same artist. But the one with red in made 3 times this one.
Does that one look like it's painted though? Because you can see at the bottom of the black. Perhaps that's a reason, perhaps not. I don't know.
It could be. Yeah, so you're quite right. This is certainly painted, where the other one was collage. So it could be the collage element has just caught someone's imagination. And the buying generally at auction and elsewhere is from private collectors. People seem to, in the same way that I warmed to Terry as a person and his art, I think people find it sort of really, they get sucked into it.
It's an interesting thought process. Let's have. Okay, so again, if we're going bold, there we go. And if you like colour.
Yeah, so we're still in the 60s here. This is 1968.
But a big departure.
Yeah, this is a big old picture. It's 2.5 meters by 1.7. So it's a real wall filler. And he calls it, rather wonderfully, colour down the side, which is pretty descriptive, isn't it, really?
I don't think you get much more descriptive than that, really, although it is colourful everywhere. But yeah, it's like a barrage of colour on the right, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're not. What are we looking at here? This one, believe it or not, was commissioned and belonged to British Airways.
Really? Gosh,
yeah, they bought it.
Was this sold recently then? I'm assuming.
Yeah. It came up in 2020 when they were having a bit of a clear out sort of post-COVID or during COVID and sorting out various things. And it was estimated rather at 20 to 30,000 and made just under 47,000. So more or less doubling its expectation.
That's a bargain, though, really, isn't it?
Yes. Well, I'm glad you said that. I thought, it's a lot of money, but when you think of it, it's a fabulous picture, isn't it? I mean, it's colourful.
But of that size as well. I mean, it's, the glorious thing for under 50 grand. I mean,
it was in their offices, so it's a big picture like this looked great there, and it's a really good buy for anybody, really.
I mean, when you look at some of the things that you could spend £50,000 on in the art world, I won't mention names, but and you could actually buy a fantastic proper piece of artwork like this from a very well-known artist on a huge scale and with fantastic provenance. £47,000 really seems like a good buy. And in my viewpoint, it could only really go one way at that.
Yeah, I think that you could be encouraged. I suppose inevitably in any market, the more people that buy stuff, the more expensive they get over time. And I still think there are buying opportunities here. This is a typical picture. I think even if you're unfamiliar with Terry and you even watched just this webinar now, you'd have your eye in for a Terry Frost. You'd be looking for the colours that we've seen here and the colours in this. You'll find yourself looking and think, I know who that's by. And he's reassuringly consistent, apart from that the very first one we saw, which is understandable before he goes for it. They're very typical and very engaging.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a lovely use of colour, and they're playful.
Yeah.
That's something, you know, obviously slightly different with the more somber ones, but they're playful, and the use of colour is ever so refreshing from this period, I would say.
Yeah, and in the 60s, he goes through I mean, like all artists, British artists in the 60s, they go through a phase where the phase and the decade reflect their styles. And so there are some really quite intense black and white stripy pictures by Terry, which I think are fabulous, but probably they're less commercial. But sometimes you get the black and white with little streaks of red and white, which lift them. So somehow they're no longer just black, they are still colourful.
Let's have a look. Okay, now this is the last image that we have, Jonathan, and what can you tell us about this? Now, this obviously,
well, I'm sort of
going off and what, yeah, it's a lot of things.
Sort of saving the best till. I'm trying to save the best till last here. That, you know, if you're thinking, you know, what do I buy by Terry Frost? Well, what about a whole room by Terry Frost? This is what you see is effectively a room set. This is where the piece was on display, and it probably looks it's a lot bigger than it looks, to be perfectly honest. But this is, what's he call it? Installation black, red, and white, perhaps inevitably.
Very distinctive, yeah.
And those are the only colours he's used. But literally, it's everything you need to fill your room with Terry Frost. The sort of boxes, I don't know whether they're furniture, I don't think they are. They are just box shapes painted red and black. And the picture on the wall reflects some of those shapes. That swirly shape.
Yeah, I was going to talk about the swirls, because we haven't really seen that in the other images we've seen today.
They're very typically Terry, but you don't see them very often. They're like sort of Catherine wheel, and as far as I can tell, he starts them from the middle. They're done in one fell swoop, just working out from the middle, getting further and further out, and then stopping, and the other shapes surround it. And this dates from 2002, 2003.
So this is right before he passed away, isn't
He's
it?
almost, you know, it's one of his last major works. So you think of the energy that it takes to produce something like that.
Did he have assistants as well, or was he predominantly a lone band?
Yeah, he had had people working with him. I mean, on this sort of scale, it's tricky to do everything. So I imagine he probably had help with the boxes. But the picture that's on the wall at the back, I would say that's probably, you know, all Terry. They might have done the preparation or whatever. And then I mentioned in the text, but I couldn't find any images. After this, he still, actually probably at this sort of time, I remember meeting him, and he was having a show just around the corner in the Whitford Gallery. And I was working at Christie's at the time, and this was a gallery show in Duke Street, just around the corner. And he had gone completely away from what you'd expect and had produced this incredible show of blown glass. So beautiful coloured glass, not quite Venetian, but almost Venetian glass. And I imagine he must have only designed that, because even Terry couldn't have blown glass the way this was. So he'd obviously, rather like a sculptor, he'd drawn the designs and then had someone make them up in glass. And that was extraordinary. He just, you know, right at the end of his career, he produces this incredible show of glass pieces, all very obviously by him, using the same colours and shapes, but it's glass, incredible.
So, Jonathan, we're coming near to the end of this webinar, and thank you ever so much for joining us again. Where can people see Terry Frost work? Because we mentioned before that the vast majority of it is in private hands, but are there any good collections around the UK that you can see?
No, there aren't. It's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but no, they are generally in private hands. Probably if you go somewhere like Southampton Art Gallery or look on Art UK, and see where they are, but there isn't, sadly, a centre. Even St Ives, that there is some. There's the Belgrave Gallery, which is a commercial gallery in St Ives. They would have at one point specialised. They may still do. I haven't been there for ages, but Belgrave Gallery in St Ives. Another dealer now in let me think now. There are 2 or 3 dealers in London who specialize in Mason's Yard. So I think maybe just Google images and see, but there isn't one place, but there's lots of different places. I imagine we've got Frieze coming up, haven't we? Frieze Masters, yes, and Frieze Modern. Yeah. That's in October. I bet you there'll be some work by Terry Frost there. So Frieze is a good place to go. But no, you sort of have to search them out. It's got a challenge.
As you were saying, though, there is a reasonable amount of stuff out there that's actually affordable. And yeah, you can go and buy for a few £100, even if it's just a print.
Yeah, if you go somewhere, maybe if you look on a site like ArtNet, for instance, they'll show you, the dealers who've got them for sale, and then what's the other one? Not Art Price, Artsy is another place to look. You can see which dealers have got them, save you sort of tramping the streets to look for them. And Alan Christea, probably one of the print dealers. But once you start to look, it gets easier. But it's not a one-stop shop, funnily enough. But the stuff is out there, certainly. And just as you said, quite rightly, it's very appealing and very affordable.
Jonathan, it's been an absolute pleasure yet again to talk to you. And
very nice
the next few weeks, we're going to be chatting to you again on a slightly different subject, but we'll release that nearer the time. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining us for the Dare Dallas webinar today. It's been a pleasure. And as we said, if you haven't seen what's actually coming up over the next few weeks, please do check our website, because we will be releasing everything that's coming out fairly soon. Please do send us any requests via email, or if you'd like us to touch on any subject that we haven't done with the webinar. And we will see you in a couple of weeks' time for our next one. So it only leaves me to say, Jonathan, as always, thank you very much indeed.
No, my pleasure, as always.
And we will speak to you very soon. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.